David Koresh, man. Wow, what a guy, right? He and his followers were known as the Branch Davidians, which was a sect from the Seventh-day Adventists. And he and his followers believed that David was the son of God. Now, David said that when he was a child, God spoke to him and said, you're special. Oh, he's special. He got called retardo in school, so he's real special. As a child, he knew he was the Messiah. He just knew it from a young age. You know, by 14, he had the New Testament memorized. And by 18, he had the Old Testament memorized. This dude had the whole Bible memorized by 18 years old. What a guy. So the Branch Davidians, he originally joined after he got kicked out of the Seventh-day Adventists because he tried to marry the priest's daughter. So he joined the Branch Davidians after that happened. The Branch Davidians were a sect of the Seventh-day Adventists, and they had a very doomsday interpretation of the Bible, and that followed through very well with the compound and the events that happened. Pretty ironic. So David originally followed behind Lewis Roden. Lewis Roden was basically the founder of the Branch Davidians. They founded it in 1959, and Mount Carmel was originally like a small community of Branch Davidians, like a really small town, houses and shit, maybe some farms, you know. And David joined the Branch Davidians after he got kicked out of the Seventh-day Adventists, and he really got to know Lewis maybe a little bit too well, some would say. But Lewis was very impressed by David's interpretations of the Bible and his ability to teach it and his ability to explain things to people. So over time, Lewis began to tell members of the Branch Davidians to listen to David as well as her. And as Lewis got older, because she was an old woman when they met, so she was getting really old and she eventually died. And once Lewis passed away, Lewis said, David, you're the successor. Now there's a problem here. There's a big problem. Lewis has a son, George Roden. George was sitting there thinking he was going to be the successor. But then David came along, banging his mom, his 70-year-old mom. You know, that's crazy, man. And for obvious reasons, they began to not get along right because George was saying, this is my rights. I own the property because my parents did. You can't just come in here and take the cult away from me, dude. This is my cult. What the fuck? So they developed some serious beef. And one day, George invited David to dig up somebody's grave and try to get David to resurrect this person to prove that David is the Messiah. If he could raise her, of course, that would prove that he's a prophet. But what David instead did is once he saw that George actually dug this woman's grave up, David ran to the cops and said, guys, this guy George just dug up this woman's grave. Go arrest him. But the sheriff said they need photographic evidence of George's crimes. Now that's a big problem because George was very scared of David at this point because David just ran off trying to get him in trouble. So George is very, he was like locked in his house. He had guns on him. He was scared, man. He didn't know what was going to happen. And some shit happened because David and a few of his closest followers, they tried to sneak up to the grave. I assume the grave was close to George's house. They tried to sneak up to the grave, take some pictures, but George caught him. George caught him in the act, man. And George came out, guns started blasting. These dudes started blasting at each other. George got shot, man. David didn't. David and none of his followers did, but George did. So that meant that David and his followers then got arrested for attempted murder. But then in trial, they all got let off. But after that happened, David and George knew that they couldn't be around each other anymore for obvious reasons. So David packed up his things and his closest followers, and they moved to Palestine, Texas, and they lived in buses for a little bit. During that time, George killed a man with an axe because apparently the man was claiming to be a Messiah. And that something happened and George got mad at him because, after that happened, of course, George got arrested and thrown in jail, or I think he got thrown into a mental institution. I couldn't tell you why. David returned to Mount Carmel with all of his boys and basically took the place over. And he made everyone who was there destroy their house. Because like I said before, it was like a village. It was like a small town. So he made everyone destroy everything, put all the resources together, and they built one big, nice compound. And that's the infamous compound that you see. So as that was happening, of course, the Branch Davidians were growing. His power was growing. Once the building was completed, there were over 100 Branch Davidians that lived in the compound. And it was only growing. And David really, if you watch some interviews, man, he seemed like a nice guy. It's not like he's a master manipulator or anything, but he really seems like a nice guy. I'd listen to everything that he told me, and I'd believe it all. Before he discovered the Seventh-day Adventist, he kind of lived in a bus for a little bit. It was kind of like a hippie vagabond kind of fella. And he also chose random people that he met and just preached to them, convinced them of, what he thought of the Bible and everything. And that's how he gained a few extra followers along the way, eventually, coming to Mark Carmel and everything. So he just go around the country befriending people, and within 2 weeks convinced them to move to a 77-acre, heavily armed compound in the middle of nowhere. Because obviously they just met Jesus Christ. There weren't any sort of themes to the people of the cult. There are people from every race, every ethnicity, every social economic background, everything. There's no like specific type. And David's rules for anyone who joined the cult were that of a typical cult. So, he used the Bible as his means for manipulation, mostly through a doomsday fear-mongering agenda that they're all going to die in their lifetime and the government's going to come and raid them. And that fundamentally laid out that they had to reject the world in every way, shape, or form, and they had to live in the middle of nowhere, of course. So they rejected themselves, they rejected the world, they rejected everything. They separated themselves from the world in every single way, and they spent all their time preparing for the world to end, in which Jesus would come down and save them. Little did they know, soon after moving to Branch Davidian compound, they were going to live with Jesus. David held some certain rules for all the women who joined, stating that they were all subject to having his children, regardless of if they were married or not, and as long as they were over the age of 14. Wow. So in 1983, David became the successor of the cult. And not 1 year later, he married a 14-year-old. It's so weird. And over the course of his reign, he had 12 children by virgins. Wow. He also forced all the men in the Branch Davidians, there's probably 70 of them, to have to be celibate for the rest of their lives. Doesn't matter if they're married, doesn't matter what. So he basically neutered every man in the compound besides himself. And he proceeded to have many children with the wives of the same men that he forced to be celibate. You will be celibate, but your wife's gonna sleep with me. He constantly beat into their minds that the government or the devil was gonna come through and kill them all. That's ironic, but they'd have to defend themselves from it, and that God would be on their side. He controlled every aspect of their lives, where they slept, what they did, their jobs, what food they ate, their routines, how they dressed. It doesn't matter. He controlled everything. If anyone misbehaved or broke a rule, David personally would spank them. Every aspect of life under Koresh and the Branch Davidians was entirely fear-based. Koresh was the only one who was allowed to read and interpret the Bible for everyone else. There was no doubt in these people's minds that Koresh wasn't the Son of God. I mean, it was so obvious. Most of Koresh's teachings, they revolved around the book of Revelations. Fundamentals of what he taught were similar to that of your average apocalyptic Christian guy who likes the Old Testament maybe a little bit too much. So he exemplified fear-mongering and apocalypse-based stuff with Koresh as the prophet and, of course, the Messiah. So in Revelations, instead of just saying what will happen, God uses symbols and whatnot to kind of explain things a little bit. You got the 7 seals, you got the 10 horns, you got the beasts, and it's all just vague enough that you can apply it to whatever happens in the future. I mean, the 7 seals, seven means completeness in the Bible. There's symbols like trumpets, bowls, the seals, beasts, heads, horns, whatever. There's a bunch of shit. And in heaven, there's a throne room with a big scroll. One big scroll, but it's got 7 seals. It's sealed a bunch. You can't open it. And the only one who can open it is Jesus. And you all know who Jesus is, David Koresh, obviously. So David, thinking that he was Jesus, was going to usher in the end times by opening up these seals. There's nothing known exactly about how David Koresh interpreted these seals or explained the seals or what he thought about them. I'm going to guess that maybe the white horse, maybe the American government. I don't know. Nobody knows what he taught besides him. And he's dead. And a couple of the Branch Davidians who survived, I doubt they'd want to talk to me. So he was probably like super symbolic and super in depth, connecting a bunch of things from other parts of the Bible to explain the seals maybe. He had some super crazy theory. So David, after apparently opening the seals, then tried to spread his message of the cult throughout the world during the siege. These are like the broadcasts that he did over the radio during the siege, which for every broadcast that he did, he let 2 children go, which was cool. But his message was basically to turn back to God, repent, and follow him, of course, and come join the Branch Davidians. Because if you don't, the end times are coming soon. And you're going to be on the wrong side, man. Unfortunately for Koresh, most people didn't repent, and they didn't come join. Nobody did. Besides a couple of journalists who snuck their way in. I couldn't find many details about what Koresh taught about the mark of the beast or the four great beasts or any of that, but we can assume that he, of course, portrayed modern day events and connected them to those kind of things. So, the crazy motherfuckers who think that the mark of the beast is like a vaccine of some sort or a bank account. The difference between the Branch Davidians and the Seventh-day Adventists, the big one, was that the Branch Davidians believe that they should not interact with the world. They should be separate from the world. So, of course, the mark of the beast would be something that is a hallmark of modernity in the world. So something like a bank account. The mark of beast, if you didn't know, is like the full compliance of evil. You're like a devil worshiper. And during the last days of the siege, Koresh began to say that he was going to bring heaven down to earth. So he clearly thought that he was Jesus and that he was opening all the seals. The Armageddon was probably discussed on a daily basis in the compound, and they probably paralleled the army of Babylon with the American government. I guess that makes sense. So the Armageddon is the prophecy that the dragon and the beast, which is Satan, versus Jesus and his followers, which of course is Koresh and his followers, are going to duke it out in the end times and see who wins. Of course, Jesus is going to win. Unfortunately, David and his followers did not win. So Koresh wasn't able to resurrect everyone and judge everybody. Who would have thought? If you want to go deeper into the book of Revelations, there's a lot of YouTube videos on it that are hours and hours long because it is a kind of complex topic. Most of them are crazy people, but the Seventh-day Adventists believe that basically the papacy is the Antichrist. And they use all the symbols and they line up with the years and the days to say, oh, the Roman stuff happened here and this happened here exactly with this. So obviously the papacy is this, and the papacy changed the day of the Sabbath, which God didn't allow them to. So obviously the papacy. So that's why David and the Branch Davidians, their day of the Sabbath was Saturday, because obviously the papacy is the Antichrist. And they did Passover still, and they probably didn't do Christmas, which those are both two things that the papacy and the Catholic Church has molested. It turns out they like to molest a lot of things. What I find super interesting about David is that he genuinely believed that he was a prophet. He wasn't using the book as a means to, he wasn't using the Bible or a religion as a means to get power. He genuinely thought that he was Jesus Christ. If David was only using the Bible as a means to power, he would not have painfully written his manifesto in the end days of the siege while having 2 bullets lodged in him. If you didn't know, at the very beginning of the siege, he got shot twice, and the siege lasted 51 days. So he was healing from 2 bullet wounds, and he still was writing manifestos and talking to negotiators about Bible prophecies and arguing with them. And that's all while he was being psychologically tortured. This video isn't going to go into the details of what happened at the siege. This is obviously about the fundamentals of his religion. There's plenty of videos about what happened in the siege. I'll leave a link to a really good one in the description below. But he was being psychologically tortured. He got shot, and he was suffering. They didn't have power. They didn't have anything. And he was still preaching, not only like by himself. He was just writing. Like, he believed this shit. He really thought he was Jesus. Some of the members said they knew they were in a cult. They just didn't care, I guess. They justified it by saying Christianity as a whole is a cult. So, I guess. But in the end, people who genuinely believed in David, as ironic as it is, got exactly what they were preparing for. For a decade, they prepared for an end-of-world scenario, doomsday kind of thing, which they got. I mean, imagine being a Davidian in the compound for 10 years, every single day. They prayed 3 times a day, by the way. 3 times a day, mostly about the apocalyptic part of the Bible with revelations and everything. And then the siege happens, and you got to live through that. You literally got exactly what you thought was going to happen to them in their eyes. During that siege, if they had any doubts before, they were all gone. They in full believed all of David's teachings and in his divinity. Because for 10 years, he beat that into them. Next thing you know, the army of Babylon is at their door, killing them, shooting their dogs. Gosh, dude, what are they got about dogs, man? They believe that the same standoff that was Waco was prophesied in the Bible a long time ago. And during the last days of the siege, all of the negotiation calls with David were just him preaching biblical sermons and the prophecies of the 7 seals. So he just fucking lost it. But about the siege itself, the ATF was like, they were very hungry for a quick and easy rebound from Ruby Ridge. Ruby Ridge only happened 6 months ago. That was a fucking disaster. So they were like, oh, we can rebound with these guys. So they were investigating the Branch Davidians and one of their businesses, which was a gun flipping business. They basically just resold firearms. And it was all completely legal, but Koresh found out that they were trying to get some dirt on them. So Koresh invited the ATF into the compound to look at their inventory and to, see what's going on. And the ATF declined to visit. Then the ATF rented a small little house on the outskirts of the compound, just a property nearby, where they put 4 agents who their entire job was to survey the compound 24 hours. An agent then acted as a college student interested in the Branch Davidians and tried to get inside to see what's going on, and Koresh kind of was suspicious about it. He probably knew, but he had nothing to hide, so he didn't care. And the agent, after pretty much joining the Branch Davidians and being there for a while, found nothing illegal was happening. The ATF has claimed that many times all they wanted to do was arrest Koresh, of course. The problem with that is Koresh every single day jogged by himself right by the house with 4 agents in that house. And he jogged far from the compound. None of his followers were around him. Nobody could have helped him. They could have just pulled up a cop car, arrested him. He went into town. He bought groceries. They had so many easy ways to arrest him. So they obviously wanted something more. They did not want to just arrest David Koresh. They wanted to save their image that was hurt by Ruby Ridge. So they instead started a siege that went horribly and showed how bad our government can be. They fabricated gun charges and drug allegations in order to get a warrant, a search warrant, like a force warrant, or raid warrant. I don't know what it's called. But the ATF claimed that they had fully automatic rifles and anti-tank guns, and even though they knew there was no evidence of such because they've been in there, Koresh was very transparent with them. The Branch Davidians, of course, they were a cult. No one's saying they're not, but they weren't doing anything that was actively dangerous to anybody. Nobody outside the compound was in danger. They didn't have plans to do anything to anybody outside the compound. They kept to themselves and they only acted in a defensive manner to the outside world. But the ATF still planned to raid in order to arrest Koresh, which is obviously a dumb thing to try to do when considering the fact that it's a heavily armed compound with over 100 crazy people who think the army of Babylon is knocking on their door. But David had an inside guy who told him that the ATF was going to plan the raid, which made things worse than it could have been because now the Davidians were ready. But when the ATF knocked on their door, David still, by himself, unarmed, walked outside the house to have a discussion with them. Like he had nothing to hide, nothing. And then the ATF shot their dogs. What else do you expect, right? And then David was shot twice. One in the, I think it was the hip, and one in the arm. And the Waco investigation of 1995 concluded that the first shots ever fired were at a group of dogs outside the compound. But after that happened, shots were being fired in, out. The Branch Davidians were firing back. Shit, hell broke loose. And the first ceasefire that occurred after days only happened after the ATF ran out of ammo. And the horrific siege lasted 51 days, and it ended in the death of 82 Branch Davidians and about 24 children, most of which were crushed or burned to death. The fire was what was responsible for ending the siege, and it's speculated that the ATF started the fire when a few incendiary grenades were thrown into the building. Who would have thought those would start a fire? But of course, years later, the ATF still claims that the Branch Davidians started the fire. So in short, a compound of Branch Davidians were illegally incited by ATF agents and were eventually psychologically tortured and killed over the course of 51 days, ending in 82 of their companions and 24 of their children being murdered by the American government. Only 9 Branch Davidians survived, none of which were children. The impact that Koresh had upon these people is obviously extremely prevalent, especially when you take into consider that during the last days, no Branch Davidians decided to leave the compound, even though Koresh allowed them to, and the ATF allowed them to. Nobody left. And the tactics displayed by the ATF and the FBI were obviously not effective, as the Branch Davidians did not fear the FBI, they did not fear their tanks, they did not fear the gas, they did not fear their guns, they did not fear the psychological warfare. The only thing that they feared was God.
The angel stands on earth and the sea, don't it make you cry? All that we can see the cloud, feel the rain fall. Don't you understand?